The US has to deal with crisis with China and Taiwan, with Ukraine and Russia. In all of these cases, the US adversary has nuclear weapons, and that gives them a lot of leverage. Now, why would the United States want to grant the Iranians the possibility to have nuclear weapons? Isn't reasonable that the US would say, it's here that we draw the line. We can't take away Russia's nuclear weapons. We can't take away the Chinese nuclear weapons. We probably can't take away the North Korean nuclear weapons without risking a nuclear war. But we can actually do this in Iran. And what are they going to do?
It's 10:30 a.m. on Wednesday, April 9th here in New York City. It's 5:30 p.m. on Wednesday, April 9th in Israel as Israelis wind down their day and begin preparations for the end of the week, the coming Shabbat, and the Passover holiday, Pesach. And I highly recommend a conversation I just had in the last episode of Call Me Back with Rachel Goldberg-Polin on thinking about the paradox of the Passover Seder and how to approach it during this year's holiday. And one housekeeping note, as I've mentioned before on this podcast, on Tuesday, May 13th, I will be delivering the State of World Jewry address and having a conversation at the 92nd Street Y. The venue within the 92nd Street Y has changed to accommodate probably unexpected demand. So if you're interested in registering, please go to the link in our show notes. I think there are still seats available. Now on to our conversation. In response to escalating tensions with Iran, the U.S. over the past month has been quietly, or maybe not so quietly actually, ramping up its military presence in the region, signaling that it is preparing or possibly preparing for a direct confrontation with Iran. 6 B-2 stealth bombers capable of carrying bunker-busting weapons have been deployed to Diego Garcia, a remote base in the Indian Ocean that's well within striking distance of Iran. At the same time, while missile defense systems have been repositioned to guard against Iranian retaliation to any strike from the U.S. or Israel or others, the U.S. Navy has extended the deployment of the Harry Truman Carrier Strike Group and has sent in the USS Carl Vinson, adding serious firepower to the region. So to many Israelis, and I think to many Americans, it came as a surprise when President Trump, sitting with Prime Minister Netanyahu next to him during an Oval Office meeting that was partially open to the press, announced that the United States would engage in direct negotiations with Iran on Saturday, this coming Saturday, in what was characterized as a last-ditch effort to rein in the Islamic Republic's nuclear program. Airing these comments publicly in the way that it was done could be interpreted as signs of daylight between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump on how to go about dealing with Iran, and perhaps a shift in how the U.S. and Israel will work together on this issue, or at least how closely they're coordinating. So we're looking at what could be a very volatile situation with U.S. military might being deployed on the one hand. On the other hand, diplomacy seeming to be well underway, although maybe those are all in sync and are all pieces in the same puzzle focused on one strategy. With us today to help us unpack all of this, especially from Israel's perspective, and help us understand what's going on, is Call Me Back regular Nadav Eyal, who is a senior analyst with Yediot Achronot. Nadav, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me again, Dan.
Nadav, I want to start with this Oval Office meeting yesterday in which they brought in the press, and both the Prime Minister and the President made comments and took questions. How did this meeting come about, and then what unfolded? In just describe to us what actually happened when the President and the Prime Minister were making statements and taking questions from the press.
So what really happened is that the president started taking questions, and most of the questions came from the American press, and they were about tariffs. And if you watch the YouTube video of this entire exchange, you see how the American press is so focused on U.S. economy. And it takes time until actually they start talking about the issues at hand in the Middle East. And then at a certain point, after another question like that, the president really needs to sort of hiss the press and say, really give the signal he has a major announcement to make. And the prime minister is sitting next to him. And then he says that the US and Iran are having direct negotiations as to Iran's nuclear program. And there's going to be a major meeting on Saturday. And then he elaborates in response to a question that this would be senior level. And there are two huge headlines. And let me tell you, some of the president's staff present in the room were surprised, not because of the news, they were well aware, but because it was made this way by the president next to the prime minister. And some of the Israeli delegation in the room and the Israeli journalists in the room, I wasn't there, they didn't think that this is going to happen the way it actually did, or they didn't think that the president would use the word direct negotiations with Iran. At any rate, the prime minister was surprised. Israel was surprised. And I published a week ago, that two Israeli high-ranking sources are telling me that the negotiations between the US and Iran are already in the making. So for the Israelis, they knew that because of intelligence, because of other sources, maybe because the Americans told them that this is going to happen. And we know for a while that this conversation about a possibility of talks in Oman, indirect conversations between the Americans and the Iranians, this might happen before any decision made by the United States, and that the United States is going to give a chance for the possibility of getting a deal. So I think the main surprise was that this was the headline to be taken from the meeting with the prime minister, that the announcement for it would be made with the prime minister on his side. Definitely not something that the Israelis like to hear too much, but they do understand that this is part of the process and that the administration needs to go through this phase of trying to get the Iranian nuclear program somehow stopped and uprooted through diplomatic means before any other means would be considered. And I need to say that then the president, in response to a question by Barak Ravid, also said that if they won't agree to some sort of an understanding as to their nuclear program, Iran would be in great danger. I'm quoting, that is the phrase he was using. And that is something that Israel is holding onto. The fact that a military strike is very much on the table, and that the Iranians are there and they are pressured as far as the international community is concerned. And this is not just negotiations that can drag on forever. So the president said that. And the prime minister was, when he came back to Israel and on his way, he made the point that this can't drag on. And he made that point mainly, Dan, because he understood that there's a deadline here. And the deadline is the snapback sanctions, which we can talk about if you want.
Yeah. So why don't you explain why there's this looming deadline for some kind of action to be taken?
The looming deadline is because of the deadline for the snapback UN sanctions against Iran. So this mechanism was decided during the JCPOA, the previous agreement. And the basis is that every party to the agreement can make these sanctions reappear just by saying that the Iranians are not answering the demands of the international community. So it doesn't need clearance from the other signatories of the JCPOA. And this is the power of the snapback mechanism. And the deadline is October 18. But actually, to get this done, you would need many, many more months ahead. Some countries argue that the US doesn't have this right because it withdrew from the JCPOA. President Trump has said that the US does have that. And as far as the Americans are concerned, they do. But you do need to convince the Europeans and other elements to abide by these sanctions. And this is the reason why there's a pressure of time here as far as the sides are concerned, the Americans and the Israelis are concerned in negotiating with the Iranians.
Okay, from Israel's perspective, if Israel was ever going to take military action against Iran, assuming there weren't these negotiations, if Israel was going to take military action against Iran to completely, permanently cripple, if not, totally comprehensively shut down Iran's nuclear program, it seems to me now would be the best time for the following reasons. One, Iran's air defense capabilities have been, if not totally wiped out, largely eviscerated because of military action that Israel has taken against Iran since October 2nd. B, Iran's proxies that Israel and Israeli decision makers always lived in fear of in terms of their capacity to respond to any action Israel takes against Iran have also been wiped out. I mean, most notably Hezbollah. That you always would hear Israeli, the players within the Israeli security system say one of the deterrents against Israel taking action against Iran was that Iran could just flip a switch and unleash hundreds of thousands of, Hezbollah fighters and rockets and missiles, and so that from Israel's north, and that's gone. C, Israel has never had, one could argue, an administration it is working more closely with, that has its back, is sending its weapons capabilities and defense capabilities on a seemingly unconditional basis, as it has with the Trump administration. And D, if Israel is ever to take military action against Iran, there is always this factor of what will be the international backlash, and will Israel be isolated internationally if it takes action against Iran? And as some Israeli officials have pointed out to me, given what Israel has experienced since October 7th in terms of international backlash and isolation and excoriation, give me a break. Like, what else you got? Is this all you have? If this is what we're supposed to be afraid of, we've just gone through the worst of it, and we're still standing. We're surviving. In fact, we're thriving. So the international backlash is not a deterrent. Iran's proxies are not a deterrent. Iran's defense capabilities are not a concern, and we have an administration that we are completely synced up with in a way that we haven't had in a long time, other than perhaps the first Trump administration. So now is the time to go. What is your response to that?
This is indeed the Israeli argument made in Washington, D.C., and let me elaborate a bit about the difference between an American strike and an Israeli strike. And I think this is extremely meaningful. What changed, what shifted, is that the Israelis are now saying, we can do this effectively, and we can do this in coordination with the United States, and we can do this alone, including its stockpiles, its centrifuges, and the components that allow the Iranians, or might allow the Iranians, to actually assemble a nuclear weapon. Now, this is new. In the past, Israel always, even 10 years ago, you probably remember one specific summer in which Netanyahu was prime minister and Ehud Barak was the defense minister, and Israel considered a preemptive strike against Iranian nuclear facilities, and then it rejected that in cabinet. And what the Israelis are telling the Americans is, we can do this if you help us with this and that component. One of these elements is fueling jets. So because it's a long flight path and you need a lot of airplanes in the air. Another element is specific types of ammunition. The bottom line is that the Israeli Air Force and Israeli defense apparatus is saying, we can do this alone. We would rather that the United States would do this. And we believe that you could be, of course, you Americans could be much more effective. We also think, as you made the case very clearly and eloquently, Dan, that this is the right time to act. There would be no better window of opportunity. They are the weakest that they have been. If you do this now, you might not only lead to the nuclear program severely damaged, but also maybe to a change or a shift in the Iranian approach. I don't want to say in the Iranian regime, but close to that. So now is the time. But if the United States doesn't want to, from its own reasons, give us that basic type of assistance and we'll go at it alone. Now, this is very different than Israeli positions in the past. Now, another thing changed, which was reported at the time, a big headline during the war, and that is that the Iranians have started exploring the possibility of assembling a nuclear weapon in a less sophisticated way than they were aiming to, let's say, 2 decades ago. So think about this as the difference between a handheld gun or having a sniper rifle. They were aiming for a sniper rifle that they can miniaturize and put in a ballistic missile and shoot. This is the highest capacity that a nuclear power can have, having this kind of a warhead that you can put on a ballistic missile. Now, what they're aiming for, according to U.S. intelligence, this was published in the New York Times back in February, they are aiming for a much more primitive design of a nuclear weapon, something that resembles more of the bombs that the U.S. built during the Manhattan Project. Now, why would they want to do that? Because the problem is always delivery. Well, the answer is they can detonate it. They can detonate it and become immediately a nuclear power. They can pull a North Korea on us. And that is what the U.S. is worried about. The U.S. intelligence is worried about. Israel is worried about, because it's a touch and go. They do that, and then what happens then? You have here certain elements that are drivers. You have the snapback sanctions that are going to expire. You have the sense that they are weak and it's a window of opportunity and the pressure of the Israelis to act. And you have the Iranians. And the Iranians have today more enriched uranium, and they have this intention probably, and they're recollaborating. Why? Because of what you said, Dan, because the wall of fire around Israel crumbled. Their idea of how to deter Israel collapsed. And for the Islamic Republic, now come people to the supreme leader and they say, your fatwa, your Islamic decision that nuclear weapons are illegal according to Islamic law, you need to change that. And you need to change that because it's the survival of our country. We have no other tools. And if he goes for it, it can be a very limited period of time until they get that primitive nuclear bomb and possibly detonate it to show the world that they are there. And even if they don't detonate it, and we know that they have it, then what happens, right? So this is the pressure.
How did Iran respond to President Trump's statements from the Oval Office?
So interestingly, they confirmed that negotiations are going to happen in Oman this Saturday. Abbas Arghakchi, who's the foreign minister of Iran, said these are indirect negotiations. The U.S. insisted more of a direct route. The Iranians are saying indirect. It doesn't really matter because the president is sending Steve Witkoff, who's basically, and I'm saying this as a spectator, seems to me like the main senior advisor of the president for anything international, or his envoy. I don't want to say advisor, his envoy. And Witkoff has shown how effective he can be with the hostage negotiations. The relations between the president and Witkoff, as far as I'm hearing, are ideal. There is absolutely no daylight there. The president trusts Witkoff. During the previous Trump administration, he didn't have a Witkoff there.
No, but he had Jared Kushner.
Exactly. Okay, so I was saying Jared Kushner.
But let me just say something about that, because this is relevant to what you're saying. One of the reasons I think Jared was so effective in the last administration is when he traveled around the Middle East, leaders around the Middle East, particularly in the Sunni Gulf, viewed Jared as not only the president's son-in-law, but the president's confidant, trusted advisor. They knew when they were speaking to Jared, they were speaking to Trump. And that is very important all over the world, but it's especially important in the Middle East. It is comparable to, I can't think of an American diplomat that has had that kind of status in modern history. James Baker with George H.W. Bush had that. Everyone in the Middle East knew that Baker, when you're speaking to Baker, you're speaking to Bush. Not only was he had an official capacity, but he was the president's best friend. And Jared had a comparable relationship. He wasn't the president's best friend. He was a trusted advisor. He was a confidant. He was obviously a member of his family. And I think Witkoff is not Jared, but I think it is well understood now that Witkoff has the president's ear, has the president's confidence, so that when you're talking to Witkoff, you're talking to the president.
Yeah, and he's a prime negotiator. This is what he does with Ukraine. This is what he did with the hostage deal very successfully.
The Russia-Ukraine thing isn't over yet. I wouldn't give him the Nobel Peace Prize for that.
Oh no, I'm not saying. I'm not. I didn't say that. My remark was as to the success. My remark was as to the hostage deal, at least for now.
Okay, got it. I said,
and we just saw another event with Trump and Witkoff and the hostages returning. And on the other hand, they're very worried. And the reason that Israel is worried about these negotiations is that they have a nightmare scenario, which I don't know if that scenario is going to happen or if it's plausible. But that scenario is that they wake up in the morning and the White House says there is an agreement, and then they look at the agreement and it's something that resembles the JCPOA or even worse than the JCPOA. And then Israel can do nothing, absolutely nothing. It cannot strike Iran when the White House is vetoing it, and it needs to do whatever basically the United States has signed on to. So as to how realistic is this scenario? Well, I think it's completely different this time. First of all, because you have in the administration both Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz making the case, and I think this is the position of the administration right now.
And I would add Pete Hegseth to your list, but keep going.
And the administration is signaling this and briefing that what they are aiming for is the Libyan model. And the Libyan model is the difference between an arms control agreement in which you control the level of the enriched uranium, you take out some of the enriched uranium, you look at the nuclear installments and the rest. And the Libyan model basically says you go to the infrastructure and you take care of the infrastructure. You take out the infrastructure completely. And Mike Waltz is on the record saying that this is what the United States wants in this case. So if this is the position of the United States, it's off the table as far as the Iranians are concerned. If it comes to that and the supreme leader needs to make a decision between the Libyan model taking out all its nuclear infrastructure or a strike, he's probably going to take his chances with a strike. So this is, as far as the Israelis are concerned, they're saying the bare minimum that the U.S. can agree to is something that is well beyond the maximum as far as the Iranians are concerned. And because of that, the assessment, at least in Israel, is that this is going to blow up unless the nightmare scenario is going to happen. And then the Israelis, at any rate, have no tools at their disposal. If the president makes the call that he wants an agreement with Iran and he's allowing Witkoff to have any concessions that the president would want, the Israelis would need to live with that. And they're not going to strike Iran against, the backdrop of an agreement signed between the White House and Tehran.
So if you wanted to put the best frame from Israel's perspective on this complicated situation and complicated set of developments, could it be, just to summarize what you're saying here, is the U.S. is going to negotiate, and in those negotiations, it is going to prove to itself and to the world that Iran is not serious about putting a pause or an end to its nuclear program, and therefore both the administration will have expose to itself and to the world why military action is the only way to solve the problem, regardless of who it takes the lead on that military action. So that the negotiations are a short, truncated, targeted approach that is a necessary step on the path to military action. That's one way to think about it. Or if somehow they reach some kind of agreement with Iran, the U.S. would only agree to a deal with Iran that, as you say, is like the Libya model, which is, while it's suboptimal that the United States reaches an agreement with Iran, it would only be a deal that is highly favorable in terms of what it means for Iran's nuclear program from Israel's perspective. So either way, Israel comes out a winner as far as its own strategic interests are concerned in these direct talks. I'm not saying, by the way, this is not my view. I'm not saying what I'm saying is accurate, but if you're looking at this from Israel's perspective, from a Israeli analysis, the best case scenario for this path is one of those two outcomes.
Yeah, I think the best case scenario for Israel, and the Israelis are making this case that the U.S. discovers that the Iranians aren't serious, that they're trying to cheat during the negotiations, that they're trying to drag on the negotiations, and they are trying to bluff the president. And then the U.S. comes to the conclusion that it needs to strike Iranian's nuclear facilities. Now, here's what the security sources I'm speaking with are saying. They're saying there's going to be an agreement with Iran, but this agreement needs to happen only after you strike them. Exactly like Hezbollah. They said, we're going to have an agreement with Lebanon, but if we're going to have an agreement without striking Hezbollah first, it's going to be a very bad agreement. It's going to be a bluff. It's the same sources, Dan, that are saying to me, you need to strike them first, the Iranians, then get an agreement with them. And the Israelis want to have an agreement. They just want to have this agreement after a strike. Is this going to be an American strike or an Israeli strike? They don't know. But if you don't take away their tools to begin with, they'll still think that they have the upper hand. And because of that, this is what the Israelis are pushing for. Now, let me give you another calculus, which I find interesting. Look, the U.S. has to deal with crisis with China and Taiwan, with Ukraine and Russia. In all of these cases, the U.S. adversary has nuclear weapons, and that gives them a lot of leverage, whether it's China, Russia, or North Korea. There's one place in the world, just one place, one region in that sense, in which only an ally of the United States has nuclear weapons, according to foreign sources I have to add as an Israeli, and that is Israel and the Middle East. Now, why would the United States want to grant the Iranians the possibility to have nuclear weapons, even the capability to develop them, not the weapon itself, which of course every administration is against, but the capability? Isn't it reasonable that the US would say, it's here that we draw the line? We can't take away Russia's nuclear weapons. We can't take away the Chinese nuclear weapons. We probably can't take away the North Korean nuclear weapons without risking a nuclear war. But we can actually do this in Iran. And what are they going to do? Iran is big on talking. See what happened during this war, as you said earlier, Dan. See what they actually achieved. What are they going to do if the US is going to attack? Now, against what I just said, there are strong voices within the US administration, within the Trump administration, that are saying, no, we need to focus strategically on China. We need to focus on what is important. We don't have endless resources. We need to really put our military assets and our attention to the Pacific and to Asia, and not to these issues to begin with. And that's a strong element around making that case. And by the way, I can understand the case that they are making.
Okay. I know that debate about the Trump administration is heated, generally speaking, on a variety of fronts. As it relates to Israel and Israel's security, I think their record has been really unparalleled. But That being said, if you had to lay out an analysis briefly, because we're going to wrap here in a moment, a world in which the strategic interests of the U.S. and the strategic interests of Israel were to diverge on this issue, on how to deal with the Iranian nuclear program, how would you analyze that, or how would you characterize that divergence? Because there are four powers in the world today that pose a major threat to the U.S. and U.S. interests: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Three of those four countries currently have a nuclear weapons capability. The fourth, Iran, does not. And it is sitting there right now. The U.S. is staring down the possibility of the fourth power in the world that is actively working against the U.S. suddenly we wake up one day and finding out that it has a nuclear weapons capability. This fear for Israel has always existed. But I just think meaning the fear that Iran, we wake up one day and learn that Iran has nuclear weapons capability. But I just think for the U.S. now, seeing what's going on in the world, seeing the volatility in the world, seeing the possibility, the potential for wars to just pop up in different regions, over the last few years. Obviously, a war in the Middle East, multiple wars in the Middle East, multiple fronts, a war between Russia and Ukraine, increasing concern about a war between China and Taiwan. And we can go on. For the U.S., you would think these concerns are totally in lockstep with Israel's, about the fear of now suddenly Iran being another power that is even a bigger threat than anybody realized. So I understand why the interests are totally aligned, but paint a picture for me where they're not.
Well, so I remark about this as to strategic priority. If you think that the U.S. has limited resources, and it does. It does have limited resources, although it's the world's greatest military power, even historically, even in relative and absolute terms. It still doesn't have the power to overstretch too much. And there, if you go into this, you don't know how this ends. The Iranians might strike against American targets in the Gulf. They might strike against the Saudi oil industry. Dan, what's going to happen when someone walks into the Oval Office and says, if you allow the Israelis to do it, not if the US does it, if you allow the Israelis to do this, they might respond against the oil industry across the Gulf and in Saudi Arabia. And this would lead to oil prices rising dramatically. And this would lead to prices in this country spiking dramatically. And why should we do that, right? Is this really something that we want to risk? Americans might die in the process. And also, let's keep our eyes on the bull. And this is the simplest argument made within the administration. Let's keep our eyes on the bull. And that bull is China. And there's an overreaching idea here made by the president. No more foreign wars. He's sometimes accused by his adversaries that he doesn't keep the same kind of position for a long time, that this position has been there for decades, that America shouldn't be in foreign wars. So, for the U.S. to attack Iran, this is not going to be just one strike and done. If the U.S. is going to do it, they're going to want to make sure that they got it right? And that would mean preparing for a conflict across the region. Also, there's a question of effectiveness. And I need to bring this up because I spoke with a former senior Israeli that everyone listening knows his name well. And he told me, look, you cannot be effective in striking the Iranian nuclear program as you think, because you usually calculate this according to the number of, centrifuges that you destroyed. From their scraps and bits and pieces, they can reassemble. Now, after they've been attacked, they'll have some support in the global south, some support with other countries. They'll say that they are the victims of aggression. They're part of the NPT. They didn't withdraw from the NPT. They never said that they're going to develop nuclear weapons, right? And then, what do you do in 3 years? You attack again? and you drag the world again to that, what's your long-term strategy? So to that, the Israelis are saying the long-term strategy is strike now, offer immediately a carrot later. That's very interesting that the Israelis would say that, Dan. The Israeli security establishment is saying, yes, you should offer the Iranians carrots. You should offer them a good agreement. You should offer them acceptance into the international arena, but you should do that after you strike. Now, another issue we didn't discuss is that, of course, the main accusation, also leveled by myself against the JCPOA, was that it didn't include its ballistic missile program. It didn't include its involvement with terror. Again, the US administration is saying, as far as I understand, no, this agreement needs to be overreaching as to Iran's activities across the region. They cannot continue on supporting terror groups and all the rest. Now, I don't know what they can actually achieve in negotiations with the Iranians.
Final question for you, Nadav. Just trying to tie together a number of threads we've addressed in this conversation. From Prime Minister Netanyahu's perspective, what do you think the Prime Minister's takeaways were from his meeting with Trump on Tuesday?
Netanyahu didn't get, during that meeting, at least publicly, anything he really wanted beyond the president's support as to Gaza and the president compliments to his leadership. Now, that's a lot because Netanyahu has to deal with Qatargate in Israel, and the prime minister is now challenged. He's challenged by these negotiations in Oman. And I think he's also challenged by something the president has said, and that is that when asked about his vision to Gaza, I'm talking about the voluntary immigration of Palestinians, the president immediately allowed the prime minister to answer first, which isn't typical. And when he answered, he talked about that. He said there are other plans as to Gaza. And I think this also is an issue for the prime minister. As to the Iranian issue that is the subject of this conversation, Netanyahu knows that he can try and influence and give the Americans intelligence as to the Iranian intentions. He can try and use his leverage and the connection he has with the president to explain what the Iranians are trying to get. But at the end of the day, it's the decision of the president, whether or not he's going to go for an agreement and what type of an agreement. Immediately when the president said direct conversations, so I was zooming in onto the prime minister's face. And I then talked with a senior minister in Israel. And he said, looking at the face of the prime minister, you could see the computer that is Bibi Netanyahu really computing the chances of everything that's going to happen. And what needs to be said doesn't need to be said. And he was saying this in a complimentary way because Netanyahu he's very talented in these kind of situations. And one of the things that he got right, I think, to his credit as to President Trump, is that he should never, ever contradict or be an open confrontation with the White House if this is the president, even if he thinks differently. And it's amazing how many leaders around the world didn't get that about President Trump, that even if they strongly, strongly disagree, and of course, many of them do, you should never make it public or else nothing good is going to come out of this. So maybe, other countries are bigger than Israel. They have other interests, but Netanyahu gets this about the president, and he knows that this is how he influences or can influence the White House. He also knows that unlike other presidents in the past, like President Obama or President Biden, he doesn't have the Republicans in the sense that he knows that the entire party is extremely loyal to the president. And it's going to be the president's call to begin with. He can't play between the Hill and the White House anymore. And that's a challenge for the Israelis right now, looking to the negotiations with Iran.
All right, Nadav, we will leave it there. Thank you, as always, and I look forward to being in touch soon.
Thanks very much, Dan. Happy Pesach.
Chag Pesach Sameach. Although, as Rachel Goldberg Poland told us today, no wishing anyone a happy Pesach, wishing a meaningful Pesach. And I'm sure we'll be in touch soon after.
Thanks, Dan.
That's our show for today. If you or your organization are interested in sponsoring Call Me Back, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at callmeback@arcmedia.org. That's callmeback@arcmedia.org. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with others who you think may appreciate it. Time and again, we've seen that our listeners are the ones driving the growth of the Call Me Back community, so thank you. To offer comments, suggestions, sign up for updates, or explore past episodes, visit our website, arcmedia.org. That's arkmedia.org, where you can also find transcripts with hyperlinked resources, which will hopefully help you deepen your own understanding of the topics we cover. Call Me Back is produced and edited by Ilan Benatar. Additional editing by Martin Huergo. Arcmedia's executive editor is Yardena Schwartz. Research by Gabe Silverstein. Our music was composed by Yuval Semo. Until next time, I'm your host, Dan Senor.